God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Please be seated. How many of you have heard of or been to an intervention? Couple. Today they're usually used for people who are abusing drugs or alcohol, and sometimes they're used to recover people from a cult. Well, in today's gospel, we have what might have been the beginning of an intervention for Jesus. Now let me remind you about Mark's gospel. It's the shortest of the gospels. It's sparse in its stories compared to Matthew and Luke, which are based upon the gospel of Mark. In Mark's gospel, everything happens immediately, it seems. Well, in Mark's gospel, Jesus has already been healing people, both in the synagogue and outside. He's been doing that on the Sabbath, in violation of custom and Jewish law. He's been exorcising demons, and his disciples have been too, for he's already sent them out, 2 by 2 in Mark's gospel. His ministry was beginning to have a significant impact. He was becoming known. Well, when we put together the lectionary, the reading in today's gospel reading is different from what's in the Bible, because in the Bible there is a phrase right before the reading today, and it says, "Then he went home," and the crowds are so great, and we go on with the reading. Jesus had just come home. He had been out and about. He had been baptized by John in the Jordan. He had gone into the desert for 40 days to pray and to meditate and come back to Capernaum and was healing throughout Galilee, and now he had just come home to Nazareth. He had just come home and was mobbed by the people. He and his followers were so mobbed they could not even get any food to eat. This was his home, where people knew him before he had started his ministry and casting out demons and healing people, where he had been Mary and Joseph's son, James's brother. And now, learned men from Jerusalem had come up to see him in his hometown and was telling everyone he was possessed. Yes, Jesus was about to get an intervention. But before this intervention was to take place, Jesus answered those learned men who had been accusing him of being possessed. He pointed out that if he were possessed by evil, how could he drive evil away? Now, as happens so often, the scribes didn't get it. Because you see, then, as now, many times we do evil to fight evil. And Jesus was saying, how can that possibly be? How can we stop evil with evil? For a house divided against itself cannot stand. Throughout the ages, religions, trying to do good, have done evil. Examples of this are the Inquisition. Not too far from here, in the 1600s, the Salem witch trials. These were done supposedly in the name of the divine. But when we look at those evils done in the name of God, we see that they did not bring communities together. They divided them. Jesus' healings and exorcisms brought communities together. When someone has exorcised of a demon, they were sent back to their community. They were made whole again with their community. Jesus was preaching a different way of combating evil. And it was 1900 years, or thereabouts, before it would inspire, both in our religion and here in this country, a non-violent way to struggle against evil. Yes, people thought Jesus was possessed because he healed in that non-prescribed way. Jesus taught that the relief of suffering was more important than the cultural norms of the day. And thinking that meant you were crazy. If we think that today, many will call you crazy. So Jesus' family came by for an intervention. Yes, Jesus pointed out that a house divided could not stand. He deflected the criticisms from the people of the big city. But his house, his family house, was divided. Jesus also pointed out to the scribes that no matter the sin or blasphemy, people will be forgiven. And this too was heretical. Blasphemy was a capital offense. And Jesus went on to say that the only true blasphemy is against the Holy Spirit. Either by denying that forgiveness is possible, and thereby cutting yourself off from the possibility of forgiveness, or by setting yourself up as the divine and denying forgiveness and grace from another. Grace is a free gift. Forgiveness is a free gift. And it's a lie from the evil one that forgiveness is not possible, that redemption and reconciliation are not possible. No transgression is so grievous that you cannot ask for it to be restored. Both you and the community can be restored. The love of God can be restored. And this flew in the face of tradition and authority at the time. And the powerful are all too loath to give up their authority over people's relationships, even their relationships with God. Throughout Jesus' public ministry, he was constantly being asked by those in authority, by whose authority do you do these things? By whose authority do you heal? We are the only ones who are allowed to do that, and only at certain prescribed times. By whose authority do you cast out demons or cause the craziness to leave a person? We didn't ordain you to do that. So surely it must be from the evil one, because we are the gatekeepers of the temple and of God's grace. Well, those who stand in God's place, in the place of the Spirit, are the ones who are blaspheming. And Jesus was in essence telling them that they might be the blasphemers, although they couldn't see it in Mark's story. Yes, Jesus was the crazy one, all right, in the eyes of the community, in the eyes of the mainstream of his day. And so his family had come to intervene. Jesus refuses to meet with his relations. He replies that the people who do the will of God are his mothers and his sisters and his brothers. And in that he was speaking in a cultural sense, in a sense of them being equals, of family, not of blood ties. Because family is where you go when you need people to take you in. Family is where you go when you need people to listen to you, to accept you. And Jesus' blood relations at the time in his ministry weren't accepting. They wanted to restrain him, not to encourage him. They needed to come to their own realization of who he was and what he was doing. It's hard to see people you love outside of the roles and relationships that you've developed with them. History with a person is a powerful obstacle to overcome. Jesus had changed, been transformed by the baptism of John. In Mark's gospel, Jesus was the anointed Son of God. Now I want you to think about your own lives. Are there people you have known who have overcome some profound circumstance? Have they changed as you still see them with your old eyes? You know, as I was reflecting on this, I'm thinking of my children growing up. And as parents, we tend to see our kids as still kids, even after they've grown. Or we see them as youngsters when they become teenagers, or still as teens when they become adults. Yet they grow and they change to be someone else. That someone else, hopefully, someone will like and respect. But it takes time for us to see that. And that's the way, the way it might have been with Jesus' family. They didn't see him doing his ministry months or a year before. They just knew him as their brother or their son. But the people around him were Jesus' brothers and sisters. And we can be Jesus' brothers and sisters when we do as he did. When we do the will of God. And not God's will for Jesus. God already has a Jesus. He doesn't need any more Jesuses. But he doesn't have a Martha or a Mark or a Paul or a Margaret. You are the ones that are to do God's will for you in the world. And when we do that, we become sisters and brothers of Christ. But what is God's will for us? How and what am I supposed to do here, God? Well, as I read and reflect on the Scriptures, what God is asking me to do, and I think a little bit for all of us, is to share and pass along the grace and blessings that we've been given. For we don't own the grace that we've been given. That we're called upon by God to be compassionate, forgiving. Because that's what God does for us and for everyone. And as we act out of God's love, we must not put ourselves up as the arbiters of who gets what, but share from our plenty or share from our scarcity, our lack of plenty. Recently, I've seen a bunch of videos online about experiments what people have done where a 12-year-old boy will sit on a bench on a New York City street in the wintertime without a coat. And somebody will be back in a doorway or something videotaping. And people will be walking by. And inevitably what happens is the person that stops and takes off their own coat and wraps it around the boy or the young person is a homeless person. Or when a person will drop a $100 bill into a beggar's cup and walk away. And then they video what that person does with that money. And they see them go to a food store and buy groceries and make sandwiches at a homeless camp and pass out the food and water to their friends. It seems as though the people with the least appreciate the little that they have, sometimes so much more than those of us with plenty appreciate our plenty. And even we have a story in Scriptures about the woman who takes her 2 cents and puts it in the offering horn. And that 2 cents is all that she has. It seems like sometimes we don't know how good we have it. It seems as though sometimes the true message of all of the Scriptures is that we are to share with one another. We are to be accepting of one another and not judgmental of one another. Judge not, the saying goes, lest you be judged. Last week our Scripture said, I come not to judge the world, but to save it. And by that Jesus meant to bring us back into a relationship with God, a relationship with the divine. Not that we should go someplace, but that we should be some way. connected to God consciously. But that is what heaven is. Heaven is where God is. And wherever God is, there is God's kingdom. Sharing this, however, in Jesus' day was blasphemy. Blasphemy in the eyes of the authorities. And he would, in the end, die for it. Today, let us remember to love and accept our true brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, and to forgive them one more time. There is no sin, no blasphemy that will not be forgiven. And sometimes forgiving our loved ones is the hardest thing to do. So let's forgive one more time this week. Because when we forgive, when we do as the Spirit does, it brings us closer to the one in whom we truly are all